Good afternoon and welcome to the Willamette Women Democrats. My name is Veronica Williams and I have the honor. Pardon me, you couldn't hear me?
I can hear you.
I'll start again. Everybody else should be muted, please. Good afternoon and welcome to the Willamette Women Democrats. My name is Veronica Williams and I have the honor to serve as the president of W2D. We have an outstanding program for you today and I am very glad that you could join us. Before I make a few remarks, several housekeeping matters. As you have joined us, we have muted your speakers and turned off your videos. We do this to improve the overall quality of the transmission of the program and to help ensure that our speakers will not be interrupted by accidental noises at your end. So unless I specifically call on you, please do stay muted and with your videos off. Please feel free to put any questions for our speaker in the chat. After her remarks, we will be introducing elected officials and candidates in the room. Then we will get to your questions. Next Tuesday, May 18th is Election Day in Oregon. In today's political environment, there is a lot about being an Oregonian for which I'm grateful. Here in Oregon, the more people who vote, the happier we are. We go out of our way to make it easy to register. We send you a voter's pamphlet with detailed information about the candidates and the ballot measures, mail you your ballot, provide postage-free return envelopes and convenient drop boxes if you prefer dropping off your ballot or waited until it was too late to mail it. Yet, especially in off-year elections, not all of our friends and neighbors can find the time or make the effort to vote. This May, most of the candidates on the ballots will be running for our local school districts, community colleges, our special districts like fire, water, parks and recreation, and there are a few special city council elections. People elected to these positions impact our lives every day, help ensure we have a well-educated population and a work-ready workforce. So I have several asks of you. If you have not already voted, please do so right after this program. Find your ballot, fill it out, and plan on dropping it off at a ballot box tomorrow or over the weekend. It is getting a little close to try mailing it. Then take a quick minute to remind your friends to vote, perhaps via Facebook, by personal email, or a phone call to 5 good friends. Let them know you would be glad to discuss the merits of any of the candidates you are supporting. Typical turnout in these off-year elections is embarrassingly low. Let's make a difference in our community and have a good turnout. I'd now like to introduce our board member, chair of our program committee, Nancy Murray, who will be introducing our speaker. Nancy?
Good afternoon. Ambassador Mary Carlin Yates has such a long and impressive resume that if I listed all her accomplishments, it would eat into our time to hear what she has to say. Ambassador Yates was born and raised in Portland, and lucky for us, has chosen to retire here. A graduate of Oregon State University, she decided to pursue foreign service instead of finishing her PhD at New York University. She packed her bags and was off to serve our country in a lot of challenging places, such as the Philippines in the midst of a revolution, then Korea, before moving on to countries in Western Africa that would serve as a focus for the rest of her career. From posts in Zaire, Ghana, and Burundi, Mary was involved in brokering peace with the help of Nelson Mandela between the Hutu and Tutsi peoples in Rwanda, and also between the opposing sides clashing in Liberia. In between assignments in Africa, Mary worked at the U.S. Embassy in Paris for 4 years. With all her on-the-ground experience in African matters, Mary returned stateside to serve in President Obama's National Security Council as Senior Director for African Affairs. After retirement in 2012, Mary served as Chargée d'Affaires in Sudan for the State Department. She's also served as a national security specialist for a couple high-profile consulting firms and does pro bono work for the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. I do feel a bit remiss skipping over some of her other important work, but let's get right to our speaker, who will address our Department of State and where we go from here. So welcome, Ambassador Mary Carlin Yates.
Thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. Good evening. And Veronica, thank you for the invitation to speak to the Willamette Women Dems. And I admire the work that you do. Keep it up. I have one quick caveat, and that is that I'm clearly not part of this administration. I live a long way from Washington, D.C., so I have no insider intel, but for those of you who know me, I do have a lot of opinions. So, and I also have the years of experience of working at state and at the Obama White House when Joe Biden was vice president. So they say that old generals like to tell stories, but old diplomats like to tell them as well. So this is a story I want to begin with about our current president. At the time, I was the senior advisor for Africa at the White House. And normally when a head of state, a foreign head of state, comes to the United States, the most prized meeting, of course, is with the President of the United States in the Oval Office. But that rarely happens because a true president runs a very, very busy schedule and the time is very, very valuable. So a booby prize meeting would be to meet with me, which would have been special assistant to the president for Africa. But even that, for a foreign visitor, when they went home, they had had a White House meeting. But of course, the next most desired meeting would be with the Vice President of the United States. So I would make an appeal to the then National Security Advisor for the Vice President, who was Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State now, and he would give serious consideration to whether the Vice President would meet. This time, it was a small African country, but I asked because I felt that they punched above their weight in security matters on the continent, certainly hosting some of our military there. Well, my request was granted. And so for a 20-minute meeting, so I escorted this African president and his entourage into the historic treaty room, which is directly across the hall from the Oval Office. And we started to wait 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And I thought, I talked about all the things I could in the room. And then the door opened and Joe, the vice president, burst in and he said, "Oh, Mr. President, I am so sorry." He said that I'm late and I made you wait. I know protocol. I'm just a vice president and you're a president. And I thought, wow. Anyway, they had a picture taken and sat down, and they probably only sat at the big historic table for only about 15 minutes. But Vice President Biden listened, and he listened intently. And I think that the African president came and said what he wanted to say, but he knew he was listened to. And he returned home believing that he and his country were real friends of America. And I think the lesson from that is if you listen and respect other people, they'll listen and respect you when it's your time too. And I have to say that Vice President Biden did that for me a handful of times when I was in that position. And it's a true story, but I think it tells you something about the measure of the man and how experienced he is, especially in foreign matters. Now, I'm dividing my comments tonight or today into two buckets. One is how Biden's foreign policy is projected to be different for the middle class. And second, what the State Department will probably need to do to adapt and make some changes, and I would add to heal. But as a preface, I want to remind people that May 7th, last Friday, was Foreign Service Day. Bet not a lot of you knew that. It was designated so in 1924 by our Congress, to honor active duty and former Foreign Service officers, that is your diplomatic corps. You know, most Americans have absolutely no idea what diplomats do for them, defending our nation and its values around the world. And I mean, I just point out what they did for the first month or two of the pandemic, when literally they worked around the clock getting stranded Americans back on planes, charter flights, to get them home to America. But my husband and I served 30 plus years, each of us, for our country. And then we happily moved back to the Pacific Northwest, as Veronica said. And I've told this story before, but we would tell folks, oh, yes, we spent our careers in the Foreign Service. And the response often was, oh, the Forest Service does such wonderful things. And I'd say, no, we were working overseas with foreigners, not trees. Anyway, that's a true story. But seriously, Foreign Service officers, like the US military, we swear an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's a diplomat's job. And what we try and do is address issues and crises before they become bigger threats to the US, when we need to bring in our military. Diplomats represent American interests, your interests overseas, and they represent America's values. And sometimes that could be a whole separate lecture in rather challenging living conditions. But this day, this Foreign Service Day, honors those of us who have served and are currently serving. And I say quite candidly this year, I think we owe a big thanks to those who have endured the last 4 years, often working in a hostile working environment. So now let me go to my two buckets. One is the thoughts on Biden and his foreign policy for the middle class. You know, during the campaign and in the early speeches of the president, he said, number one, we would mend tattered alliances around the world. He's working on that. That we would re-engage the community of nations to defend freedom, democracy, and human rights. He's also working on that, including rejoining the UN Human Rights Council, and that he would put diplomacy in the center of our foreign policy so we could take up the mantle of leadership again, and that has been sorely absent. But what does this mean? It means sort of renewing multilateralism, which means the international fora like the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and even the African Union. You know, I was really pleased when I read that President Biden sent a video message to the annual African Union summit, you know, all of those blank hole countries. And he reached out and said what he wanted to do to work on climate change and pandemics, and also the restoration of some of the democratic backsliding on the continent. I must say the African leaders were very pleased with that outreach. And that was in February. That was really warmly welcomed by the African leaders. So in these initial foreign policy speeches, both the president and the Secretary of State appeared to almost erase the clear distinction between foreign and domestic policy. In other words, they said that if we're going to promote democracy and human rights around the world and combat the rise of authoritarianism abroad, then we'd better start by getting our own house in order at home. Democracy writ large is being challenged globally. We can think of Russia, we can think of China. So we need to prove that our democratic free market way of life can deliver for the people in the heartland. We have to be able to refute the authoritarian dictators of the world who challenge that their way of governance is better and they're better at taking care of their people. So after these early foreign policy speeches, I mean, the professors and the pundits are all contemplating, well, what does this really mean? Foreign policy for the middle class. So in March, the Biden administration put out an interim national security strategy. They promise a full one later in the year. And I found it as a helpful guide to Biden's vision about national security and what needs to be done to achieve it. In his cover letter, and having been part of this process in the past, I know how important those cover letters are because they actually pen them. I remember I got back from Barack Obama with his handwriting on it. Anyway, we will only succeed, this is in Biden's cover letter, we will only succeed in advancing American interests and upholding our universal values by working in common cause with our closest allies and partners. That's the foreign part. And by renewing our own enduring sources of national strength at home. Well, you may be wondering, what are these enduring sources of national strength? The president details that. It's our diversity, it's our vibrant economy, it's our dynamic civil society, it's our innovative technological base, it's our enduring democratic values, and of course, the most powerful military in the world. So this is again from the president. He said, we have to lean forward, not shrink back. We have to boldly engage in the world to keep Americans safe at home. So we have to meet global challenges with American strength. And I also liked it when he said that middle America has to be shown that Americans leading the world is not an investment so we can feel good about ourselves. It's going to be how we ensure the American people, how we can ensure that the American people are able to live in peace and security and prosperity. So it's really in our own self-interest to do this. So, and I must say that the threats today are so numerous and diverse, from the pandemics to climate change to cyber warfare and violent extremism. I mean, the list goes on. We know that you can't meet these, the United States can't do this alone, but they also can't, the world can't do it without the United States. So the president is working on this all being a collective action. And before I leave this section, because I've been reading and trying to learn about this as well, and I think you'll be fascinated with some of this. You know, the Carnegie Endowment did quite a study of a couple of years and published this 83-page report in September of 2020. And the title of that report was Making U.S. Foreign Policy Work Better for the Middle Class. And a good article about that, it was in the Atlantic Monthly, about Biden's foreign policy starts at home. So I think a lot of people think that this sort of basic concept of President Biden's is exactly why he picked Jake Sullivan as the National Security Advisor, and as his counterpart, Susan Rice, to head as director of the Domestic Policy Council. When Jake did not get, and I call him Jake because I do know him, he didn't get the opportunity to be Hillary's national security advisor in 2016, as many predicted he would. He spent the next few years studying and dissecting what went wrong with the Democratic playbook that allowed this reality TV star to become our president. I worked with both Jake Sullivan and Susan Rice directly, and Jake is just one of the smartest, most strategic thinkers that I have ever met. In addition, he's humble and quite nice. But Jake and Salman Ahmed, who's now the director of policy planning for Secretary Blinken, they both worked on this report. And in the report was based on interviews. I found this interesting. They did interviews in Ohio, Colorado, and Nebraska, no coastal states. And the research rather quickly indicated that the Democratic Party had lost touch with Americans in the heartland, and that US foreign policy goals had become untethered from ordinary Americans. For example, the report asked, well, what does it mean to middle America if North Korea expands its nuclear capabilities? Or, and I throw in that Trump threw out the JCPOA with Iran. So what if you're from middle America? What matters to the people in Ohio, and I might say in Oregon, is that we not have a terrorist attack here on our soil, and also that there's not an international crisis that increases our energy prices. So the research revealed that our foreign policy really lacked the connective tissue to average American lives or ordinary American lives. So this Carnegie report asks, well, how can America play a leading role in the world if we first or simultaneously aren't redressing our own democratic deficits, social, racial, economic, these injustices at home? Also, while at the same time trying to take the moral high ground abroad. So the report back in 2020 said we have to get our house in order. And of course, we're hearing that echo through the Biden administration documents as well. And all of that was written before the January 6th insurrection. But I also don't want to leave with the misimpression that President Biden's ideas came out of think tanks only. And of course, he has these people on his staff now, but that foreign policy for the middle class is genuine Joe Biden. He has dedicated his life through the decades, from his Scranton working class family to his own personal hardships to a lifetime of service to the American people. And I read in an article the other day that they said he's the one that when staff come in to brief him on new ideas for tax reform or healthcare thing, he's the one that says, wait a minute, what's that going to mean to the single mom in Ohio with 2 kids working 2 jobs to make ends meet? So this is genuine Joe Biden. So the Biden-Harris Build Back Better platform and the newly proposed infrastructure bill, they're all aimed at strengthening the homeland so that we can remain competitive with China and other nations. And one final thought on this, and I hope some of you can help me if Oregon has a connection to this, is, you know, this administration seems to be doing a lot more outreach to governors and mayors, I think initially over COVID coordination, but now some of the local officials have raised their voice and said, we deserve a seat at the International Foreign Affairs table. But I discovered that back in June of 19, during the Trump administration, the US Conference of Mayors, they already had passed a resolution that called and asked the president and the Congress to pass the City and State Diplomacy Act. And this was to establish the Office of Subnational Diplomacy within the State Department. It would give a direct channel then for mayors and governors to help shape foreign policy. So that was back in 19, but in February of this year, the Brookings Institution picked up this idea and made some recommendations. So I say, watch this space. Let's see what the administration and Congress does. And if someone's listening and knows any role that Oregon played in this, developing this City and State Diplomacy Act, I would be very interested in knowing that. So my second bucket is to talk about our rather wounded State Department and its personnel and what needs to happen to help implement some of these policies to strengthen America. Well, I can say, having done it a few times, and my husband as well, steadying the foreign policy ship of state after any change of administration is always a little bit tricky and rather interesting. Externally, when you're abroad, as a diplomat, of course, your host country wants to know, what's that mean for us? What's that mean for our bilateral relationship? So you get to try and explain that. But internally, I always found too, that some of the younger officers were confused. Well, what are we going to do? Are the programs going to be the same? I said, look, we swore our allegiance not to a president, but to the Constitution of the United States, and the American values don't change with an election. So we still support democracy, the rule of law, fair trade, open markets. I mean, this is who we are. This is our bread and butter. So, but I have to say the past 4 years have been a roller coaster for diplomats at home and abroad. Diplomats were asked to defend the president's promotion of conspiracy theories, for example, and the nation's humiliating handling of the COVID response. Diplomats even faced headlines abroad in foreign capitals calling us the banana republic. So unfortunately, Trump viewed our nation's professional, nonpartisan foreign service officers, his diplomatic corps, as partisan. He labeled them deep state, and he assaulted the State Department's integrity. This damaged our international reputation and American diplomats and their ability to work on America's behalf. And it certainly negatively impacted our recruiting. The numbers of people taking the foreign service test were way down. I said, I can't imagine having been ambassador at this time and try to explain to young diplomats how the commander in chief just fired Marie Ivanovich in Ukraine and the secretary of state didn't even stand up to her. How do I tell my young diplomats then that, we've got their back? Anyway, I've digressed. But I have to clarify that the diminution of US diplomacy and the sort of tattered state of our State Department can't all be blamed on Trump. Budget fights and DOD dominance overseas because of our never-ending wars, and then who was going to be in charge of the peace building began decades before. And it's very recent that some bipartisan Hill leaders said, we've got to stop trying to solve non-military problems with military tools. And I can tell you, I think our US military would be the first ones to support that idea. So strengthening American diplomacy to meet today's challenge is really an urgent matter. And it's generated a number of studies and also congressional proposals. Sadly, what President Kennedy envisioned many, many decades ago, and almost every president has built on, was that America would have the best, brightest, and internationally represented diplomatic corps in the world. Plain and simple, that is no longer the case. China has more diplomats in more countries and more embassies and consulates throughout the world. The numbers of our diplomats overseas have fallen dramatically. That's another long story. A simple way that some people explain it is with the baseball analogy, and they say China's at bat, we're in the field, but we don't have a full field. We have no shortstop, we have no second baseman, and we've got one outfielder. So it's a little bit hard to win. So first, the very first thing that has to happen is we have to get more diplomats hired and out in the field. And that takes funding. So in order to push diplomacy front and center in our foreign policy, the president has requested in this year's budget cycle a 12% increase. I'd like it to be 50, a 12% international affairs budget increase. And that raises it to 63.5 billion over the 61 billion last year. And the budget goal of this is to grow the foreign service, the civil service, and USAID, because it's been decimated in the last 4 years. So we're no longer the leading diplomatic service in the world because we haven't invested in it. And Biden says we have to solve this problem. If we're going to fight to maintain our influence and our role in the world, which, oh, by the way, this is his words, affects our own prosperity and security in America, we've got to solve this problem of our diplomatic corps. This new budget envisions about 1,000 new officers coming in to state and 650 to USAID. The current total at state is about 9,000. To give you a little perspective of that, 1,000 would be a good bump up. And it would also possibly open some training opportunities, because unlike the military, who take people out of commands and bring them back and send them to a year of training or this or that, we can't take them out of the field. We don't have enough people in the field to cover all the jobs that are out there. So anyway, I just have to make one more contrast to the Trump administration. What did they do? Each year, they asked for a cut of 1/3 of the international affairs budget to be cut by 1/3. And Tillerson and Pompeo vowed to do it. But usually a Secretary of State historically has fought to defend the budget that they put forward. It is a miracle that we got the budgets each year because of the bipartisan support of our Congress, because they're the ones that know what the diplomats do. They visit you, they know. Anyway, I'm sort of on a kick on that one. I also have to mention that the state budget is so dwarfed by DOD, you have to put it in perspective. If state is asking for 63.5 billion, the request for DOD is 715 billion. So last little subject here is what has to happen within state with the diplomatic personnel. There's widespread agreement from the Hill and within government agencies that our foreign service needs to look like America to be truly representative of us overseas. It's not going to be easy to both grow the Foreign Service and make it diverse and inclusive to represent America. But that is what the Biden-Blinken team have promised to do. There were decades when we made real progress of getting more women and persons of color inside to, as they nicked the moniker, the pale male and Yale Foreign Service, as it was known for decades. But during the Trump administration, in addition to cutting the budget and the incoming Foreign Service classes, the diplomatic corps lost a lot of senior talent, and some were being forced out. Others chose to leave rather than sort of violate their own principles. And literally, there were very few jobs for senior people. There were fewer career officers being offered ambassadorships. There were 0 assistant secretaries of state. These were given to political appointees by Trump. The persons of color at this point were leaving by droves because they had lucrative and attractive officers elsewhere. So now, today, and this comes from the apps of the Foreign Service Association, these stats, the Foreign Service is 87% white and 2/3 male. And that is a huge backslide from what it was in the 1980s when I came in. So recently, President Biden named, it was Secretary Blinken who announced it, a retired 30-year veteran, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, as the first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the State Department. And Secretary Blinken said in the announcement, our diversity has always been a source of American strength when we go overseas. It's an example for the world in our immigrated background. Diversity and inclusion really make our diplomatic corps stronger, smarter, more creative, and more innovative. But finally, I think we have to see what the administration, I'm going to be interested to see what the administration can do to make these changes. There was just an article this morning. I don't usually read the Huffington Post, but it was like a strong article saying they had all kinds of statistics and stuff saying the backsliding is serious and they don't know if they can fix it. So, but I think some good news is for these past 4 years, many smart people, academics, former diplomats, etc., worked and have come up with studies about how we can come up with what needs to be done to come up with a diplomacy for the 21st century. I think that's the title of the Harvard study. And they interviewed all sorts of people. So if the Biden administration decides to move forward and make some of these changes, a lot of the homework has been done for them and they can adopt and adapt from those good studies. Because I think I need to end by saying our world has changed, so so have our diplomatic priorities. So it's only logical that the diplomatic mechanisms and staffing and training, these all have to be updated to address the new national security concerns from cyber to climate. And I want to thank you for inviting me. I had a third section I considered thinking about what would be the President Biden's big surprise, like the Bay of Pigs. But I think I'm going to have more fun listening to your questions. And I like the idea of closely linking foreign and domestic policy. And I think we need to have more conversations like this, where foreign affairs work is shared on the local level. And I am greatly relieved that our national security is in hands of veteran people who understand foreign policy. And also, I believe the State Department is on the road to recovery. Thank you again for having me, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much for that whirlwind of lots of information and a great oversight. Before we get to the questions, I do want to recognize some elected officials that we have in the audience. If by chance you are on a phone, so I just see iPhone or a phone and no name, please feel free to drop me a note in the chat so that I could recognize you. But I do want to welcome Mayor Jules Walters from West Lynn and City Council member Bridget Brooks from Tualatin and City Council Member Valerie Pratt from Tualatin. So I hope I didn't miss anybody else, but if I did, please drop me a note in the chat. And then in the meantime, everyone else, please get your questions in the chat, and I will be glad to ask them. So the first one, Ambassador Yates, is a very easy one. What is your opinion about removing troops from Afghanistan?
That's a very complicated question, and I don't really have the expertise and experience to differ with the president. I have been reading, as I know many of you have. There was a letter that just went out from a number, signed by a number of ambassadors and former military, and it was speaking on behalf of that we must do something to protect those who work so hard to protect our military and our diplomats serving there over this 20-year period. Ironically, my husband and I were not asked to sign that. We're asked to sign many things, but I don't think I was asked to sign it and missed it in the inbox. But what's important is, if you think back to what I said about building America's strength so that we can continue to compete in the world, I think what the president has stated and intends to do is build America strong and use the resources at home, and in other international priorities. But I think we're going to have some back and forth in this period. And I read the other day that there's already possibly some slippage of the September dates, but I think the decision has been taken, and now they need to sort of mitigate it so that the people who were so loyal to us, the Afghans, are protected.
Thank you. Our next question is, what can you say about the role of the CIA in international policy? Has it increased over time or with different administrations? How difficult does this make the role of the State Department employees?
That's a very good question. I'm going to start by saying, and I just want to say, Veronica, that last question was not what I'd call easy.
I was being sarcastic.
Anyway, the Central Intelligence Agency, and those of you who know how an embassy works, you are the chief of mission as the ambassador, and you're the president's representative. So if you think back to how Washington works, there's the president of the National Security Council, and each of the major agencies comes to the White House for the national security meetings, and differences of opinions are worked out there. But when you're overseas as the chief of mission, all of those agencies work for you. They, of course, report to their own agencies, but you are sort of the conductor of this orchestra. So I found that it was really important to have a good relationship with my CIA or station chief. And they had the obligation to share with you what they were doing in the country. They didn't have to share with everybody else in the embassy what they were doing in the country. And because you had information and insights that could be of value to them. I would say that many times it was a positive relationship and there were very positive results. There are other times, and in the team of people working in the agency, sometimes they didn't always see it the same way as state or other representatives. So, I mean, that's a little inside an embassy, but I think the CIA role on the national security level, where I got to see it work at the White House with the President's Daily Brief, the PDB, that the last president didn't care to take. Anyway, I think that that was sort of foundational in much of the information that helped us form our decisions in National Security Council meetings. And I think it is a stroke of brilliance that President Biden has selected Bill Burns. I read an article the other day that said he is the one of a generation, like Brzezinski, like Kissinger, who is brilliant and, could almost do anything. If you haven't read his biography, I suggest you do. So I feel comfortable. And one thing too, that it's out in the press, but even in his role as CIA, he was the one that went in April to have some early private secret meetings with the Iranians somewhere in Europe to start discussing the JCPOA and how, if we ever could get back into that. So, he's going to play a key role. Anyway, enough on the CIA. Next question.
Next question. A question, do you think former state people might return? For instance, Marie Yovanovitch.
Actually, I don't know the answer to that. I think she could return in just about any kind of role she wanted. I believe I read she's writing her memoirs, and she probably would be most effective in an advisory role. But she received last year a huge honor. Georgetown's Foreign Service School honored her, and the speech, there was hardly a dry eye in the place when you listened to what she said, but I also think her testimony was just quite extraordinary during the impeachment trial. So, but I think of her, I had 30 plus years. My husband had 35, 38 years, imagine that many years dedicated to your country, doing your job, and then you get fired by your commander in chief. I just can't even imagine it.
Well, I think it was pretty amazing. And just my personal comment, I thought that more people learned more about the amazing talent in our State Department during those hearings than they probably had up to that point in time. It was just unfortunate that that was the vehicle to showcase the quality of people that we have representing us abroad. So that's my
a very interesting observation. Thank you.
So the recent increase in fighting in Gaza illustrates, this is Persis' question, the failure of the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. What can the Biden administration do to stop this?
This violence is clearly some of the worst that has happened in more than a decade. And early on, we read that of course, everything is a priority, but then nothing can be a priority. And that the Middle East was not going to become, this is now pundits writing, was not going to become the president's quicksand. He has some other priorities he wants to do, and a lot of it starts with the homeland. I think that this sort of explosion of violence is clearly going to have to draw his attention and very senior people. It sounds like the Secretary of State has already been involved in phone calls. I have read that someone senior is going out to the region. So it's very early on. It's too early to say what is going to happen. Your question, or the question that came in, was about the peace process. And, I've been around long enough to have watched wonderful things happen, in the 70s with Sadat and Begin. And in the 90s, do we have leaders that can try to bring this forward? You're looking at Netanyahu, if he makes it through the weaker month, and Abbas. They are not the leaders of the past, and it has to start with the people on the ground. But again, I'm on a bit of quicksand myself, since I do not profess to have any in-depth foreign policy understanding about the Middle East. I read, just like all of you, about what goes on there.
Well, to take you to an area of your expertise.
That's dangerous.
How are West African countries holding, I think it's up, in the face of the terrorist organizations and the ever-present issues of corruption and fair elections? And then how do diplomats and our military coordinate there?
Those are good questions. And it's hard to generalize even in a whole area of like West Africa. And of course, some of the bigger problems have come in the Sahel. First of all, there are countries that are real leaders in democracy, like the one I was privileged to serve in as ambassador, Ghana, that has, successive free and fair elections. And just re-elected their president, Nana Akufo-Addo. They are leaders for some of the others in the region, that is for sure, when it comes to democracy. There are regional organizations as well that have political and military committees to them. ECOWAS is the one for West Africa. And those presidents meet and their secretaries of defense or their ministers of defense and the ministers and their foreign ministers to discuss. So they help each other, and they also serve as election watchers for each other. So there's a lot that goes on that never is shown, I mean, practically outside of West Africa. The military, I mean, the question about the coordination, again, your defense attaché and anybody working in the military is under the chief of mission authority in the country. And the US military presence in a country can be a very wonderful thing. I mean, I made reference when I talked about the West African president who managed to get his vice presidential meeting. And it was because they did things to help us do enhanced security, whether it was exercises together or helping with a base or helping welcome a fleet of ships that would come in to do training with their Marines to fight off drugs that are coming in. I mean, it was just, I really welcome the cooperation of the military inside the embassy. But it seemed to me I lost a thread in the question. It was about terrorism. Is that the?
Well, we were talking about corruption, fair elections, and then just sort of the role of our diplomats and the military to coordinate, with those countries.
Right.
Issues.
Well, I would just clarify that the corruption issue would be addressed by the state political and economic officers. That would not be so much in the military lane. They would be there for security enhancement and the relationship on that, sometimes material purchases as well. The counterterrorism, that kind of falls between, because if you're fortunate and have either a DEA agent or an FBI agent, and I had both in Ghana, they're focused on some of those things as well. So then in your country team, you coordinate that with your defense and security people. So anyway, I don't know if that helps.
All righty, thank you. So here's another question. You talked about the challenge to bring on up to 1,000 new Foreign Service Office personnel. And the question is, how can the Department of State improve hiring and personnel to attract young professionals, given the long and burdensome hiring process, and also the new issue that is starting to come up with marijuana legalization and people getting security clearances? So thoughts on that? And I do know the hiring process is really quite long. Federal hiring is not always fast in general, but I think state has maybe holds the record.
Oh, I think it holds the record. Yeah, I mean, it's not unusual that it's 2 years. This is after you pass the Foreign Service exam to get on the register and come in. And yeah, it's very burdensome. It's a long process. And I do not know if state is considering, I mean, they have modified the testing procedure several times over the decades, but it still has the elements of taking a written exam and you pass that, and then you take the oral exam. Sometimes they call it in-basket exam. Sometimes they put you in a group, and these are the things that have changed over time. And then they sort of rank you and decide where you come on the roster. I mean, if you pass the written exam, you'll make it on the roster, but are you going to be 330 out of the class that, passed? And then, maybe if they need somebody who's an economic officer, it comes up and down. I am sure all of this is being looked at. I don't have a view of it. And one thing I can say is they had come up I think it started in the 90s. First, there were the Pickering Fellows connected to Howard, and then the Wrangell Fellows, and these were programs to attract diverse candidates into the Foreign Service. They did some of this with other programs for women back in the 80s. So they would attract more candidates to come in. But in the last administration, those programs were put on ice. But I've already heard that they're probably going to be reinstated. And one other way to introduce foreign service and the diplomatic life to people who wouldn't otherwise think of it is it's very coveted in many colleges that you would be able to go as a summer intern. And some of them work in the State Department, but many of them come overseas. And it's great fun, if we have 1, 2, or 3 interns. Our daughter, who was in the embassy in Singapore, I mean, I think she had a half dozen or more interns before COVID come to the embassy there. But they stopped paying them in the last administration. I mean, just a plain salary. And of course, then you go back to who is available, Mail, Pale, and Yale. So you can't have a summer off without any income. So I think, in fact, I wondered when I saw the statistic that 1,000 people are sort of what are budgeted, and it was a big year if we would be bringing in, gosh, I think 300 to 400 foreign service officers in a year, like a class, 3 classes of 100 some each. So is that 1,000? That's not going to take 3 years to get in, hopefully. So, I mean, I don't have the inside information, but whoever's asking the question, you're asking the right question. I mean, it's a difficult process. I don't know anything about the security clearance in marijuana, but things are changing all over the world. That is one of those questions that they ask you every time, even when you renew your security and what about your drug use or something like that. So, and when they go and do the security clearances and talk to other people, that's one of the things they always ask. Well, what about their alcohol use? What about their drug use? So, it comes out in different ways as, whether you say yes or no. So I don't know what will happen to that, but yes, it is changing in a number of states, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay, this is an interesting question. It seems like Europe is not meeting its goal of being a stronger group unit than separate countries on their own, as shown by their poor vaccination rate, for one. Is their bureaucracy so burdensome that the blame lies there or elsewhere? So, European Union questions.
Yeah.
And there's lots tied to that one in other directions. But
there is. I'm not sure that the vaccination issue is the right one. I mean, I think before COVID-19, the European Union had challenges, and I was posted in Paris at the time, when they came up with the euro, and no, the French aren't going to give up their franc, and the Germans aren't going to give up their Deutschmark, and this was never going to happen. And then it happened, and so this union was formed, and this union was stronger than any of the countries individually, even though some of them pulled more of the weight than others. I think the pandemic has been sort of a shock to the system, but not just to Europe. I mean, you can talk about, Asia has probably done better than many of the regions. And I do think they're attempting to coordinate. I'm not a Eurosceptic. I don't think that even Brexit is going to cause the demise of the European Union. It may be weaker, but I think it's too early post-Brexit to know what's going to happen with the European Union. And I think that they have to have Brexit happen at the same time as COVID. I think you've got to wait and see what the European leaders, I mean, what's going to happen post Merkel in Germany, for one thing? Is Macron going to be reelected in France? Another big surprise. And some of the same points that I was making about, getting your own house in order. A lot of those countries are having serious problems with right of center leaders drawing, their populist, their nationalist leaders. And so I think we have to see what's going to happen in some of the European elections as well in the coming months and years.
Thank you. And that is going to be our last question, although I can think of a lot more. Thank you so very much. This has just been wonderful, very informative. A lot of times we've spent a lot of our conversations focusing domestically, I guess I will say, when we're national, and then we spend a lot of time focused on our state and our counties and cities. So this has really been great to take a look at the US abroad. And thank you so very, very much. For everyone else, I want to tell you that if you'd like to hear some more from Ambassador Yates, on May 25th, she will be co-presenting a World Oregon program on the topic of rethinking America's grand strategy. So that is through World Oregon. If you Google it, you will find it. There's no cost for that program. So I encourage you, if you would like to hear more, to do so. I would like to invite everyone to join us on June 10th. We will be having a June Zoom program this year. The topic is 3 new mayors and the challenges and opportunities they face. And we will be joined by Mayor Lacey Beatty of Beaverton, Mayor Joe Buck of Lake Oswego, and Mayor Jules Walters of West Lynn. So come and hear this important discussion of what's going on in our communities and the challenges of becoming a new mayor and helping lead your city forward, especially in the time of COVID, which might or might not have been on your plans when you decided to run for the office. So we look forward to seeing you next month, and please all take care and enjoy our lovely weather. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we can stop recording, Patricia. So I think you can probably see the chat. I don't know if she might have left. Okay.
What a gracious lady she is.